Hello and welcome to our webinar on employee self-service forms and workflows. This is part two. Part one was 2 weeks ago. It's more of a business overview of scenarios and such. This one's going to be a much deeper technical dive into how a couple of these solutions are built. Let me just share my webcam out, what the heck, to start with here. Greetings from my home office. Everybody self-isolating and hanging in tight, I hope, and staying safe. So we're going to spend the next hour and go through in a fair bit of detail under the hood on two of the scenarios that we covered in the previous webinar. The first is around a leave request process, and the second is around an expense form submission. There's two different technologies that we're going to be using those. The first will be using Microsoft Forms and Flow for Power Automate. The second will be using an HTML form where we have a little bit more control over how we present that form, and then that'll be posting into a Logic Apps, which is actually the underlying technology that powers Power Automate. So here, let me turn my webcam off, and I'll just advance to my next slide here. So all my contact information is up in here. We're going to be posting the recording and the slide deck. My goal, and I'm going to talk more about this later, is to actually post a number of the artifacts from what we're going through here as well. So if people want to get their hands dirty and actually try some of this stuff out, you should be able to do that. I've got a number of staff on the line, including Logan, who's our manager on the sales side of things. So if you have any sales inquiries, you like what you've seen here, but you need a little bit more help to help maybe implement this into your organization, Logan's your guy to go to from that point of view. I always like to start with a bit of a poll of the audience, just to get a sense of who's got what expertise as we're going into this. So let me just go ahead and share this poll out. I'll launch that. I'll give you about 30 seconds to a minute and just respond back. Which of any of these are you currently developing in? Bearing in mind this is a technical session, you don't have to be a hardcore developer to attend. Absolutely, you're going to learn stuff regardless, but we are going to get into PowerShell, into HTML, into Logic Apps, flows, and such. And I'm just going to kind of want to get a sense of who's worked with that so far. So about half the folks voted in there. So I'll give it another 30 seconds or so just to collect response from that. And then I'll share this out so everybody can see as a group what this looks like. All right, give you about 10 more seconds. And just closing that out. Okay, so let me share that out with everybody. So about 3/4 working in Office 365, and that is our context for what we're talking about here today. Having said that, I mean, there are hybrid solutions where you could use the technology that we're talking about, particularly things like Logic Apps and Power Automate can actually reach into your on-premises SharePoint and things like that too. So, we could look at hybrid solutions as part of this as well. Microsoft Forms, almost half. It's a really easy tool for creating quick surveys and forms. So we're going to start with that as a scenario and then move into Power Automate or Flow. About 2/3 of the folks working with that. Almost half, 40% web stack developers from an HTML, CSS, JavaScript point of view, which is great. That's our second scenario that we're going to go deeper into. Only about 20% on the Logic App side. Don't be afraid of that though. I mean, the Power Automate folks on the call, you're going to see that Logic Apps is very familiar to you from that point of view. In fact, it's the exact same designer interface you use in Logic Apps that you do use in Power Automate. Okay, so with that, let me hide that poll. And let's move on to our agenda. So we're going to start with a little background, from an employee self-service point of view, get into some base security considerations that really apply to any sort of employee self-service scenarios that you want to look at. And then we're going to get into our first scenario, which is the expense form, which is using Forms and Flow or Power Automate. I still call it Flow, old habit. And then the second scenario will be an expense form built as an HTML form and submitting into a Logic App. So before we get into the details of those specific scenarios, I mean, there's lots of scenarios that we can talk about, and we went into more depth in this in the previous webinar, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this side here. But one of the key things, particularly from an employee self-service, is security considerations around this. When people are building forms, often they don't think about the security implications of who gets to see this data. Any sort of employee data is inherently particularly confidential, whether that's leave requests that haven't been approved yet, expense forms that are being submitted in, change to banking information, payroll stuff. There's a lot of confidential information in there. So you really have to make sure that you've thought about the security considerations as part of that. Obviously staff need to be able to see their own requests, and I'll get into the information architecture of what we've built out here, but basically we create folders for each staff member, but it's also important that not only direct managers, but indirect managers have visibility to their staff as well, so that they can approve things, and to do that, they need to be able to review them, see that history from that point of view. And some of the other considerations you have to take into account is, well, what about changes? I've submitted something, it hasn't been approved by my manager yet. I've now discovered, hey, there was another receipt I forgot on my expense form. I need to resubmit that. What does that look like? And am I able to do that after it's been approved, or I just submit a whole new request to be approved? There's different ways you can deal with that. What about cancellations? I put in a leave request for a vacation. Obviously, vacation plans have pretty much been shanghaied the last number of months with COVID and people not traveling. So how do we deal with those cancellations and properly account for that from that point of view? So we're actually going to use our Envision IT company itself as the scenario for these. We're not a big company. We're 17 people. Pretty flat structure. We've got myself at the top, president and CEO. I've got my management team and sales and marketing and senior consultants reporting up to me, and then the director of development, Dinesh, is really responsible for the technical team. So all the folks on that team report up through him. So really, everybody either reports to Dinesh or myself, and then Dinesh reports to me. So we've got a 2-level reporting structure in there. So if we think about what's the information architecture of what we're building in SharePoint, because SharePoint Online is kind of the repository where this is all wired together for both of the form examples. So we've got lists for expense submissions and leave request submissions. What we do is we've created folders for each of the employees underneath each of those lists. And you don't normally think of using folders in lists, and in fact, it caused us a little bit of grief. We weren't able to use some of the standard connectors in Flow because of that, but it actually gives us a lot more flexibility from a security point of view. Because in addition to security, you have to think about scalability, and what we don't want to do is have every single form have unique permissions on it. There are scalability limits in SharePoint, even in SharePoint Online. They recommend no more than 50,000 unique security permissions applied to items in a single list or library. You can actually exceed that pretty quickly with a decent sized organization and enough forms going through. So you want to have that thought about in your information architecture. So this way, what we do is we apply security at the employee level, and then all the list items within those folders just inherit from the folder. So it makes the security a lot easier, and it also makes it a lot more scalable. Now, obviously, this solution is not going to scale to organizations with tens of thousands of employees. I'm not suggesting this type of solution for that, but for a small company or a mid-sized company up into a couple hundreds, we've done a similar solution up into the low thousands of employees before. It does scale well from that point of view. Now, the other key part about the information architecture is that these processes often need to know things about the employees. What's their full name, their email address, their employee number, what's their allocation of vacation days, how many have they taken already, how many they have available, who's their manager and their manager's manager, and all the way up the hierarchy. That's key data that we need to have. And rather than duplicating that in each application that we build, we decided, well, let's create an employee data folder structure and keep that employee data in there. So if I flip over to the live side, we're going to do a lot of demos as we go through here. Let me come to my first tab here, which is the Employee Self-Service Center. So this is literally our production Office 365 tenant. I'm not usually that guy that says, hey, I don't test often, and when I test, I do it in production. I'm kind of breaking my rule here today and doing that here. We were kind of hustling to get this together for this webinar, but the goal is to build a proper development environment as well as production environment to test this all in. It just becomes a challenge because we've got all the users and manager reporting structure set up in prod. It was easier to accommodate from that. But regardless, don't encourage you to follow that lead, get a sandbox and play with this stuff here. But what I do want to do here is take you through a number of the things that we've got in here. So if I come to my site contents, and we think about that information architecture diagram that we were just looking at, so we have this employee data document library with a number of items in there. It says 34 when we have 17 staff. That's because we've got 17 folders and then 17 employee files in there. And then we've got a list to keep track of the expenses that get submitted and approved for the leave requests. And then we actually have another list so that when the leave requests are fully approved and set to go, we actually put them into a calendar that everybody has visibility to. So you can quickly see, hey, who's got upcoming personal days, vacation days, jury duty, whatever the case may be from that point of view. So if I dive down into this employee data folder, so as I mentioned, we've got folders for each of our staff in here. So if let's actually use myself as an example. So if I drill into my folder itself, the only thing we have in here is it's a JSON file. So it's something we've created through PowerShell, and I'll show you how it's created. And it basically has all of my employee information. Now, in our example, we're doing that through Active Directory. So we're actually pulling most of this information from Active Directory. But there might be an HRIS system or some other system you use for tracking employee data. You could actually pull in from that. And the beauty of the solution I'm going to show you is that that's all done in PowerShell and Azure Automation. It's easy to extend. There's no licensing implications around premium Power Automated Flow licenses as a part of that. It takes all that heavy integration lifting, puts it in one place, and creates this JSON file that then can be consumed by any of the workflows or any of the processes from there. And you can see this hierarchy structure here. It shows who your manager is. In my case, I report to myself. It's kind of weird from an Active Directory point of view, but that's how we've set it up. If I was deeper down in the hierarchy, I would see a deeper tree of managers through there as part of that. So if I go back here, let me just close this out and, come back to the employee data for a second. I didn't pause on my folder when I clicked into that. So let's just go ahead and click on myself in here and open up the information pane in SharePoint. And what we'll see at the top here is actually the unique permissions that are being applied to that item. So it's my folder, so I have access to it, so I can read from that. Now, nobody actually needs write access into this because everybody's just consuming it from a lookup point of view. Deb is our Director of Finance and HR, so she needs visibility across everybody in the organization. And right now, Kate is the developer that's been building all this. So she's kind of having the same rights as Deborah to see across this. We'll remove those rights and set up a dedicated service account for this later once we make it actually live and real from that point of view. Whereas if I look at somebody else, like let's say Logan, for example, you can see the permissions are a little bit different there. So I still have access because I'm Logan's manager. Kate and Deb still have access from an HR oversight point of view, and Logan himself has access because he needs to be able to submit requests and see information from that. So that's how we've structured the employee data in there. Now, if we come back here and we look at one of the forms, let's start with the leave request. We're going to get into more detail in a minute in terms of how this works. Right now, we're seeing a flat view where everybody's got the request there. And because I have sort of global access, I see all of that. We've actually got a whole bunch of different views defined here so we can see historical requests, unapproved ones, upcoming. So we can actually use the views to drive the process through there. If I switch this to all items with folders, I'll actually see that folder structure there. And this is where we have the permissions, just like the other one applied through here. So if I come down to, sorry, my browser is freezing on me here. I was just going to go into mine as part of that. No, Office 365 is not cooperating with me. There we go. There's my Peter Carson folder. And we'll see the same permissions through there. And if I drill into that one, we'll actually see the list items within that folder. So even though this isn't a document library, these aren't files that we're talking about, you can still use that folder structure from a list point of view, which is a key thing to remember. What I had to do when I was working on the list is actually go into the list settings and configure to allow folders for that as part of that. So it's not there by default, but it's an easy thing to turn on in any list. Okay, let's come back to our presentation. So how did all that get set up? We don't want to manually maintain all those folders and permissions and everything else. We want that automated from structure in Active Directory and other systems that we might be pulling that information from. So we do that all through PowerShell. We could have built a workflow in Power Automate or Logic Apps to do this. Personally, I find that PowerShell is actually an easier tool for building this kind of stuff. And then Azure Automation is basically a way to run those PowerShell scripts. So you don't have to have it running on a server somewhere. You actually put it up in the cloud in Azure Automation. You can schedule it. It runs in the cloud serverless. Microsoft takes care of the management of the servers and all the infrastructure around that. So it becomes a very easy way to manage all that. So let's have a look here in Visual Studio. You don't have to use Visual Studio for any of the solutions that I'm going through here. I just like to use it because I've got everything in source control here, and I can pull up the various different source files that we've got through there. And the plan is to take these files and put them out into GitHub so that you'll be able to access them yourself and have a look through there. So this script here, it's got a bunch of helper functions at the beginning, but the main meat of it starts here to go through and create the staff folders. Now, we need to know whether we're running in Azure Automation or locally. I really like to debug scripts locally in the PowerShell ISE environment. It's a very easy way to step through, and I'll show you what that looks like. And then once you get it right, you push it up into a runbook in Azure Automation, and you can run it up in there. So let's actually switch to that environment. So if you haven't used Windows PowerShell ISE, I strongly encourage you to check it out. If you're doing any PowerShell development, it makes your life tremendously easier. If you're used to Visual Studio, a lot of the keyboard shortcuts work the same way. I can hit F9 and set a breakpoint in my code, and I can run to that point and step through it. I can also do all that through the menu interface through here as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit run on this script and kind of walk you through what some of this looks like here. So it's first checking to see, hey, am I actually running in Azure Automation? And right now we're not. We're running on my local machine. So I'm just going to get a path to my local script location, pull up some environment settings. And what we do, this actually lifts from what we've done on our Teams provisioning stuff, if you participated in past calls around that. It allows you to configure different environments, make it easy to store the credentials for that securely in your local Windows Credential Manager. So I have a whole technical document on the Teams provisioning side. I think I'll be able to lift a lot of that and pull it into here and make it available for you if you want to play with these scripts from an employee self-service point of view. So basically, it's asking me for my environment that I want to connect to. Now, I've got my two prod environments in here. You'll see I've got two different connections, one with MFA and one without. I'm actually using my own account. Normally, you would be running this under a service account to do this. The first time I run it in my ISE environment, I have to use the second option, enter my credentials manually. I'll get an authenticator prompt on my mobile device to do the second factor authentication, and then it runs through from there. Once I've got the solution open and running, I can rerun it from there, which is what I'll do now. I'll say I just want to go through the default, and it'll actually pull the credentials from my local credential management. So it's a fast way to kind of stop and start and retry and work through from there. So what the script is doing, I can actually hit F10 and go kind of line by line how the script is running and saying, well, I need a local directory to create some temporary files. We use PnP, which was the Microsoft open source stuff to connect to SharePoint. So I need to connect to the SharePoint site that we're storing all this in, but I also need to connect to Azure AD. So one of the steps I had to do was register an app in Azure AD. That's documented in the team stuff. I'll provide the documentation around that as well. But basically, there's a client ID and secret that allows me to connect to Azure AD that I can then pull that employee information from there. So it's doing a call out to Azure AD saying, hey, get all the staff. So it's got a particular filter. It's saying it has to have an employee ID filled in. That's how we differentiate staff from all the other service accounts, guest accounts, things like that we have in our Azure AD. And it's saying pull back all of the employee profile information as part of that. It's hard to see with the line on there. You can see it here now. We're getting the email address, the UPN, the display name, and even further in down here, we pull back the employee ID, the manager, all as part of that. And basically, we spin through each user as part of that. So we've got 17 users coming back from Azure AD, and I'm going to spin through a loop here. I'm not going to walk through step by step all of the code here, but I'll kind of explain what it's doing as part of this. So what it does first is it actually creates the JSON file for the individual user that it's processing right now. And it populates all the stuff that comes back from Azure AD as part of that. And then it does another call out to Azure AD to actually get the manager of the current user that it's processing. It grabs all of that user's data, and that actually goes through a loop there where it keeps digging deeper and deeper down through that hierarchy until it finds somebody that reports to themselves, which is the key in our Azure AD to say, hey, you're at Peter at the top of the level. You don't need to go up the hierarchy anymore from that. So it's not limited to two-level hierarchy. You could have it as deep as you want and structure it accordingly as part of that. So it's basically building up this JSON file and keeping spinning through that and ultimately building out this user JSON file. and it writes it out to that file that we opened at the beginning. That's happening on the local machine. And then it checks to see that it's got the employee folder for that. That function will create the folder, set the permissions, do all that kind of stuff as part of that. And then it adds the file in there. And then it also goes through the other list. So it goes through the expense list and the vacation or the leave request list and creates the folders in there and secures them appropriately from there. So it spins through all 17 users, does that work, and it's finished from there. So, I mean, you could schedule this to run on a nightly basis or after you do any changes from an Azure AD point of view. It's really up to you as to how you want to structure that from that point of view. It's basically building the information needed for the rest of the processes. So let's go from there and dive into our first deeper scenario, which is actually the leave request form. So I demonstrated this from a user point of view in the part one of the webinar. I'm going to go through that process again just to give you a quick sense of what that looks like. It's a very simple form. There's only 5 fields on there, 4 of them are required. What type of request, start and end date, number of business days, and we don't even auto-calculate that. It's up to the person filling it out to account for stat holidays that cross over their vacation time and things like that, and just put the actual business days in there, and then any comments that they want to enter in as part of that. And we built the form using Microsoft Forms. So if you haven't used Forms before, it's a really dead simple way of creating quick entry forms. It's not a full application like a Power App would be. It's not something you can come back to later and edit the form. It's very much an enter and you're done type of form, whether that's a survey or in this case a leave request form. And if you think back to my earlier points around security considerations, I mean, we basically took the whole, hey, how do I change my leave request off the table? You cancel it, you start a new one. You know, there's no ability to reload a work in progress into Microsoft Forms and do changes to it and resubmit it. It's very much an empty form, submit it, and you're done. Which actually works pretty well for our scenario from a leave request point of view. And when that gets submitted, we actually use Power Automate or Flow to trigger off of that. So we've got a trigger that says, hey, when a leave request form is submitted, start the Flow workflow and go through from there. Now, if you're using Office 365, which is the scenario here, you actually get Flow licensing as included as part of your Office 365. Our goal was to not use any premium connectors as part of this. We kind of broke that a little bit. There's a couple of things that we can't do with Flow, like putting a list item into a folder through the out-of-the-box connector. So we had to call HTTP endpoints to do that. I'm going to err on the side that, hey, the spirit is that using the Flow licensing is for when you're talking to Office 365, which we still are. So I'm not sure whether Flow would actually block you from using that connector if you didn't have any premium licenses in your organization, or whether you need to just buy one. Don't quote me on the full licensing approval from Microsoft. As you get into the legal side of it, you'd need to talk to the legal compliance side on that side. But really the spirit that we had was, let's keep this as a standard solution. And the ability to post from Microsoft Form into a Flow, that's the standard, and all the other things that we're doing in there, the approvals, the emails, that's all pretty standard as well. I mean, basically the way it works is you fill out the form in Microsoft Form, that triggers the Flow, it goes to the manager for approval, gets recorded in the employee file. When it's approved, it's posted to the vacation calendar, and a notification goes back to the employee. So let's actually go through that scenario live together. So if I come here to my home on the employee self-service, and I say I want to submit a new leave request, this is just a web link that we put on this page that links to the Microsoft form, pulls it up. And here, let's say I want to do a vacation day. I'm doing a lot of one-day vacations as I'm going through the dry runs for this. We'll do it for Tuesday next week. And we'll just do it for the one day. So total business days 1. Leave the comments blank and go ahead and submit that. Okay. So let's have a look at what's happening under the hood, because it'll take a second for the flow to kick off and start running from there, and then we can go from there. Actually, no, I just got a toast on my phone saying, hey, you've got a notification for an approval. So that came through pretty quickly. Let me look at my email. Yep, here's my email that came through. So this is the out-of-the-box flow approval email that comes through. Now, we're not putting a lot of detail in here right now. One of the future steps that I'm going to mention later in my wrap-up is, I'd like to see more details of who it's for, what the comments are, basically all the details I need to approve this, how many days do they have available, how many in this request. So I don't need to look into the list to see any of that. I can see it right in the Outlook email. Because this is using what's called an Outlook actionable message as part of action cards. And the beauty of this is that I don't need to leave Outlook to work on this. I can literally just hit the approve button here. I can put a reason if I want in there and go ahead and submit that. And you'll see that it's almost a forms experience right within the email. And the email has now changed. So if I was to come back to this request email later, I wouldn't be confused as to whether I'd already approved it or not, because it actually tells me I've already done the approve on it. So it actually changes the email in my inbox. And the workflow actually just sent me another email here saying, hey, your request was approved. And if I'd put comments in the other one, which I probably should have just to demonstrate it, they would show up in this email here. And we have complete control. I mean, we can make those emails much richer in terms of what they present through there. Okay, so let's have a look what's happening under the hood as part of that. So if we start on the Forms side, so I'm in my Microsoft Forms. Now, we've got Forms Pro set up as part of our tenant. Stuff that I'm showing you here doesn't require Forms Pro. You could actually do it with the regular Forms. So you don't need a paid subscription as part of that. I didn't actually create this form. Kate created it, so she's shared it with me, which means it shows up in my Forms environment as well, and I can open it up through here. So if I want to do any edits to the form itself, I'm now in the designer right now, even though it looks like the form. If I click on one of these, I want to change the options that show over request type, change the ordering on them. I can do that all through here. I can update all these questions. I can add new questions. I can even put branching logic that if you answer question A in a particular way, maybe skip question B and go straight to C. So you can start to get some sophistication in through there. And then when you want to try it out, you can actually preview it in here. This is actually a live preview. So if I was to fill out this preview and hit submit, it would actually trigger the flow workflow just like a regular leave request form and go through the workflow from there. I can see the responses in here. Forms actually gives me a nice little graphical view of showing the different types of requests and such. I'm not sure if we actually want to keep the responses in here because there's confidential information in here, concerns around who would have access to see that. I haven't dug into it, but maybe there's a way that the workflow could actually remove the response from Forms once it's processed it, so it no longer shows here. So we really want it just in those folders in the SharePoint lists where we've got appropriate permissions around it. All right, so let's switch gears and go over to Power Automate. So if I come into my flows, again, I didn't create this flow, Kate created it. So if I go to my team flows here, and this is something I strongly encourage you to do anytime that you're building forms or you're building flows. One of the first things you should do is share it with somebody else so that you've got multiple eyes on it, you've got easy access from multiple people into it. It's not just your own personal flow. So we can look at it in two ways. We can go into the designer, but before we do that, I'm actually going to go in from a status point of view, and I can see the run that just ran 3 minutes ago. So let's actually go into that run and have a look at it. And the neat thing with Power Automate, Logic Apps does this as well. When I come into this view, I probably should have paused before the approval and shown you steps as we went through. You'd actually live see that. So you would see, green or orange or empty check marks to show you where that flow is in its process right at that moment in time. And as people approve, you'll actually see the check marks live show up here. You don't have to refresh your screen. It's a pretty cool way to see in flight as the workflow is running what's happening through here. So the workflow is triggered off of a form getting submitted. So that leave request form is tagged in here, and that's what starts the whole process. And basically what it does is it gets the response details of what was filled into that form, and then it reaches out to that file path that we were showing before of where that employee data is. And it pulls out all that employee data in. So it can get things like the employee ID, the manager ID, and it has to do a couple calls to SharePoint to get the actual SharePoint ID for that, because when we do a post back in, this is the one that we couldn't do directly through the SharePoint connectors, because we want to actually post it down into a particular folder. So we had to call the underlying SharePoint web services through that. And Power Automate is pretty powerful. I mean, it allows you to do these sort of HTTP posts and integrations and such. We're kind of getting out of the realm of the citizen developer. But the beauty of a solution like this is once you've built this once, you could actually create a template of this form workflow and give it to somebody else to say, hey, if you want to build another employee self-service form, take this as a starting point and just leave all this beginning stuff as it is, and then just tweak the details that are specific to your particular form. So somebody wouldn't necessarily need to understand the deep inner workings of all this to be able to tweak and adjust it from there. So we've basically posted the leave request into the appropriate folder for that person. We pulled back the ID of that item that we've put in there, and we started an approval process. And basically, this is using the manager that came back from that employee data to decide who do I need to send that to, and what happens if they approve it or decline it. Now, this is a one-step approval. We originally thought about having an HR approval step in here. For us, we decided to keep it simple and say either Dinesh or myself approve, it's fine. It doesn't really need to go to Deb from an HR approval point of view. Go ahead and update that item as approved, and also create an item in the vacation calendar for that and send that email that we saw at the end as part of that. So if we come back, that was looking at a particular run through as part of that. Let's actually do a edit view on that, and we can see the designer interface through here. So when I first create this flow, I have to sign in to a number of different services that I'm using. So I have to sign into Office 365 so it can retrieve forms, it can connect to Outlook, it can do things with SharePoint, and whatever credentials I sign in with that is how that runs. So Kate created this. She's signed into a bunch of those connections with her account. So if we look at the email that came across, it actually came from Kate because she's the one that created that. Now, what we generally do when we move this to production is to create a service account with a service mailbox like employee self-service. And then the email would come from employee self-service. If somebody replied to it, you can set up rules as to where that routes to and who else is CC'd on that. So maybe HR or somebody in operations knows about that. So those are some of the steps in terms of making it full production ready. And it basically gets the list of responses and get the details from there, and then it's doing those various different calls out. Now, there's a number of these parse JSON elements in here, and these are a little bit tricky to figure out how to do. Basically what you do, if I duplicate this tab here, and I come back to that run that just ran through, the easiest way to create up the schemas you need for the parsing is to actually do a run through. Know that it's going to fail because you don't have everything properly configured in there, and then go back to that run and grab some of that sample data from there. So if we think about here, we're at this step where we want to parse the employee data that came back from this get here. So if I look at my run history, I can actually grab the content that came from this. And this is literally the contents that's in that file that I was showing you before. So if I select all that content and I come over to my editor and I hit this generate from sample, I can actually put that sample payload in there. When I hit done here, it'll actually update the schema with a matching schema for that. Now there's some caveats to think about. When it generates that schema, it doesn't understand if, maybe some of these fields are filled in sometimes and other times they're not. So the types of string, you often have to add a null to that as well, so it will accept null values through there. You'll see errors in your script, and that's why if you come across that. So that's basically how you build out these parsing elements to get that data back from there. Now once I've done that, let's see if we come back to the start and wait for approval here. Basically what we've done here, if I remove this particular item, I'm not going to save this because I don't want to mess up my flow, but basically you've got this dynamic content that's looking at the things that were sent across, and we have all these different parses that are happening here. And this one here that was parsing the manager has got an email. That's actually the one that I want there. So I want the email address of the manager to assign the approval to. So that's how we use the data from here, where we parse this out and use it here to actually drive the approval to the right person through there. So it's all driven from what's in that employee file there, and that actually drives the approval process through there. So it becomes very powerful in terms of how you drive that. And you could use any of that employee data. If you think about the expense form, that employee data could have, minimums required before approval. So if somebody submits an expense form for $20, and maybe you just don't care about approving those, it's not worth the time for that, you trust your employees, you could put some employee data to say, any expense form for this employee under a certain amount, just auto approve it. And then the form, the flow workflow could actually take that in from there. So you can start to build pretty complex workflows. And it's all done through this drag and drop interface, of just adding different actions in through here and building out that workflow. So before I mess up and hit save by accident, I'm going to go back here and throw those changes away. And let's actually take a slower run through there just to show what that looks like. So let's go ahead and submit another response here. We're going to do another vacation. We're going to do it day by day as we go through here. So let's add in the Wednesday. We'll make that one day as well. Let's actually put a comment in here and go ahead and submit that. So if I come back to my run history here, so we'll see that that flow is actually running right now. So let's open it up. So we can see it's got the response. This orange here means, hey, I'm still in flight here. So I'm waiting for an approval step right now. In fact, if I look in flow in my approvals here, I'll actually see that received request. So it shows here in flow, it came up because I've got the flow app installed on my iPhone as a toast on my phone, and it comes through as an email to me. One of the things I'd like to see is have these come as actionable messages in Teams, because we tend to use Teams more than email these days. That's something future state that we're still working on from that point of view. Okay, so I've got that approval in there. What I want to do is come back here. Let's just refresh this page. So I want to show you how we're using a number of these views to drive the process here. So here I've got my pending requests, and the current view that I'm on is intended that I'm looking at my own employee page. So it's only showing pending requests that are assigned to me as a manager and upcoming requests that I have as an individual and my historical requests. So think of this as sort of a dashboard for a single employee from there. We don't have the ability to switch to a different employee just yet, but we have the ability to switch different views in here. Yeah, so I could flip from that unapproved view to an unapproved manager, that would show me all the unapproved across different people. So Dinesh has a bunch in here that haven't been approved. There's some that aren't assigned from testing point of view. This is showing me that whole view from that perspective. So we can drive that process through here. If I come back in here, let's go ahead and approve that. I still have the ability to add comments. Go ahead and confirm that. And you can see, if I refresh this, it's now succeeded. So it's gone through the approval, sent the emails, it's all done from that point of view. So that's an overview on the leave request. I know I haven't timed this webinar before. I'm already at 12:38, so I want to be mindful of time. Let's switch gears from there. There are a couple closing points that I want to put in here from a consideration point of view. So we already talked about the security side. This ability to display the allocated, accrued, already taken. The concept there is to actually put it right on the home page here. So right now, this is dummy data. This is not actually live data, but we could create a little search query web part without any custom coding that would show me that data based on what's in the lists from here. So that could become part of the process. I mentioned changes before or after approval. We're just going to have them cancel it and go from there. In the future, we talked maybe about having that integrated in with our time tracking system. That's very much a phase 2 or later phase from that point of view. Okay, so let's switch gears into the expense report side. This is a more complex form because we've got now not just individual fields, but we've got these sort of repeating table concepts where I can put in any number of expenses, any number of mileage trips as part of that. And that's not something that I can do in Microsoft Forms. In fact, we've built stuff like this in Power Apps, and it's actually really difficult to build it in Power Apps too. So the HTML is our go-to. We're very comfortable from a building web form point of view. Obviously, you're out of the citizen developer and more into a true developer point of view. But the goal here is to still not require a lot of heavy back-end lifting, that it is a very simple HTML form There's not a lot of jQuery and JavaScript involved in it. So you don't need to be a really hardcore developer to be able to build something like this. And that was our design goal here. So, they've got a number of fields that they need to fill in. We've got some mileage calculations, a number of cents per kilometer, some totals to auto-calculate, and then be able to submit that form. Now, this was a little different. We want to be able to modify it after submitting. Now, we haven't got there yet, but I'll talk about how we plan on doing it. We need to be able to lock it once it's finance approved so that you can't change an expense that is already being paid out from a finance point of view. We'd like to have the ability to scan and attach receipts. That's kind of a future state as part of that. And maybe PDF the whole thing from a records retention and that perspective. And ultimately, if we want to get fancy, we use Telpay for our payroll. We also use it for our expense payments to our staff. It'd be nice to be able to generate a CSV file or something like that we can import into Telpay, just have that expense go from there. The reality is it doesn't take that long to do that manually because we're only 17 people, but part of this is a proof of concept just to demonstrate the art of possible from that point of view. Okay, so let's have a look at the form itself. So if I come in here and I say, hey, I want to submit an expense form, we've actually left SharePoint and we've gone over to, it's called an Azure App Service. I'm going to talk more about this in a minute. So the HTML form is hosted there. It's got a little bit of JavaScript and jQuery behind it. It does know who I am. So I'm already logged in through Office 365, so the form auto-logged me in, and it's pulled in my employee email from here. There's some security stuff we still need to talk about implementing in here because this isn't super tight security. When this submits to the back-end Logic App workflow, it provides that email address. Somebody could spoof that and submit on behalf of somebody else. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but nevertheless, we want to make that secure from that point of view. So I basically come in here and I pick it out. Let's do it for last Friday. I'm going to put some expenses in for that day. Maybe I went out for lunch, but that's happening a lot these days. Actually, I had my first drive-through takeout on the weekend with my wife. We've been eating in otherwise all the time through there, but let's put in $25 for lunch. And maybe I need to do some driving as part of that. How many kilometers was that? Let's say it was 50 kilometers. We didn't go far there. There's our mileage calculation, and it auto-calculates all these items here. I can put some notes in there and then go ahead and submit it. Now you might be asking, well, where's that actually submitting to? I'm going to show you under the hood what's happening, but the short and skinny of it is that it's submitting to an HTTP endpoint on the Logic App. So it's actually triggering a Logic App, just like the Microsoft Forms triggered the Flow workflow before. And the reason that we're using Logic App instead of Flow is that this scenario would get us into premium licensing in Flows. In Logic Apps, it's a consumption model. It's a much cheaper model, literally millions of cents per action that gets executed. So it's a more cost-effective way of doing it. I actually like Logic Apps from an enterprise sort of software development lifecycle point of view as well, and I'll talk more about that in a minute as well. Okay, so we've submitted our form in through there. Let's have a look at what's happened with that. So if I come to my leave requests over here, or sorry, not leave requests. Let's wait for the menu to come back up again. There we go. I want to go to expenses. So we've got all our folders here. So if I scroll down, where are we? Oh, sorry, I'm at the top. Got a weird sorting going on there. Okay, so there's our April 3rd that we just put in there. It's currently submitted. It's not manager approved yet. We've got the date for it, the expense items, mileage items, the grand total through there, and it's now waiting for approval. So let's look first at how the form was built, and then we'll switch over to the workflow side of things. So if I come back to Visual Studio, and I start with the form itself. So it's, it looks a little scary if you're not familiar with HTML, but it's actually pretty straightforward. We use Bootstrap to make it mobile friendly. So whether I'm on a mobile device or a desktop, if I take this, actually I haven't tried this to see what it looks like. We'll do a little live demo as we go through here. Let me bring up the developer toolbar and switch that into mobile view. Boom, hey, works nicely. So we get a nice smartphone type of stack presentation as part of that. I can flip that back into desktop mode. it lines up nicely from that perspective. Okay, so we've done that with a little bit of Bootstrap, a little bit of styling in through there, and basically we've just got an HTML form in here with a bunch of labels and input controls for the various different things. You know, the date picker, the email box that's set as read-only so that you can actually change it, the itemized expenses and additional rows, the mileage side of things, and then the section for the totals and notes and submitting it from there. We've got some jQuery, Bootstrap, JS Deliver, a bunch of different open source pieces that we're using as part of this through here as well. And the very bottom part is an important point as well. So I mentioned this is being hosted in an Azure App Service. We've turned on Azure AD integrated authentication. So to get to this page, you have to have an account in your Azure AD, so it's not just anonymously available to anybody. And this script here is basically wiring off of that. We've got a client ID register for this app in our Azure AD so that we can call in there, figure out who the current user is, display their username, display their email address, make that read-only as part of that. So a little bit of script to provide that authentication piece as part of that. And then we've got some JavaScript behind this. And again, you know, it might look a little scary if you're not familiar with JavaScript and jQuery, but it's actually pretty straightforward once you start looking through it. So we've got a bunch of things here for like adding and deleting rows. So when I'm on an expense form, you know, I can hit plus through here and start adding new rows. I can remove rows that I don't want through there. So that interaction is just these couple of lines of jQuery here that's doing that. So there's sections for deleting expense rows, adding expense rows, deleting mileage rows, adding mileage rows. And then down here is doing the calculations to say, okay, calculate the 55 cents per kilometer, calculate the total expenses, the total mileage, and the grand total through there. So that's all pretty straightforward when you look at it. And then this is the magic here where it actually submits the form. So this URL, we'll have a look at that in a second, it actually comes from Logic App. So it's provided by our workflow as an endpoint that you could submit to submit all your data. And basically you take all the data off the report. So this is just grabbing all the various different fields off the report, and it's building up a JSON block that is going to ultimately post to this URL to say, hey, here's all that data from there. And if that all works fine, then just put in your thank you for submitting. Otherwise, hey, present some sort of error message through there. So again, pretty straightforward. And once you've got this as a baseline to work from, you know, adding fields, making a whole new form built off this structure is actually not hard to do. That's why I'd like to open source this stuff out. I think people could get a lot of value in terms of the structure and how we've kept it fairly simple from that perspective. So let's switch gears from there over onto the workflow side of things in terms of what happens there. So I filled out the expense report workflow. It triggered the Logic App. It's now pending approval at the manager level. We had plans for a finance step here. We haven't got that whole step in there, but it's just extending the Logic App workflow, recording that in the employee file, notifying the employee, and ultimately possibly exporting that out to Telpay from a payment point of view. So I mentioned we're using Logic Apps to do that, and it's actually the platform underneath Power Automate. You'll see the same designer. There are differences, like the approvals are not as rich in Logic Apps as they are in Power Automate, but you can still do them. It is nicely integrated with Visual Studio, and it is very cheap, you know, less than $1 a month for these scenarios, probably into the pennies from our scenario with 17 staff. Okay, so let's have a look at the Logic App side. So I do need to go over to the Azure portal to do that. This is where citizen developers maybe get scared or they're just not allowed to go here because the Azure portal is very much a techie environment to work in. But basically, we've created a new Logic App through here. In fact, if I do an edit on the Logic App, you'll see a very familiar interface. This looks exactly the same as what we see in Power Automate, and that's because Power Automate is actually built on top of Logic App. So this designer interface, all the parsing of JSON that we're doing before, it's the exact same steps. In fact, you can take a Power Automate and turn it into a Logic App. You can take Logic App, turn it into a Power Automate, so they can move back and forth. Caveat being if you've done, for example, something in Power Automate that you're not allowed to do in Logic App, like the Power Automate approval process, it won't let you move that one across until you remove those actions. But it is very transportable back and forth as part of that. Now, Logic Apps has not just this designer view, but it does have a code view as well, which if you dig deep enough, you can find this under the hood in Power Automate as well. Basically, it's a JSON structure that represents your application. Where this becomes useful is we actually check this JSON into our source control. We can actually do version differences as people are working on the Logic App workflow. Our Azure DevOps, our source control, will show us those differences. So if I come back to my Visual Studio here, and if I come into, oh, I don't actually have it in this one here. I've got it in a different project to show you. We'll leave that for another day. But basically, it's very easy to identify exactly what was done through there. Okay, so let's come back to the expense form. So if I refresh this, we can see that we have a running one there. The reason it's still running is because it's waiting for my approval. If I come back to my inbox, here's the Logic Apps approval. Now, like I mentioned, it's not as rich as the Power Automate one. So we don't have the ability to put additional copy in here and change the look of this. It's a very rudimentary approve, reject. So in this case, you'd have to drive people back to the form itself to be able to see the details from that point of view. Or we could generate a second email prior to that. We're working on extending this, putting our own adaptive cards in here so we do have better control over that. That's a topic for another day. We have done some interesting work there. But it works the same as the Power Automate. Ultimately, I do the proof here. It is still an actionable card, so it all happens in place in the email. And we should see this update here that workflow is now succeeded. So it actually went through very similar steps to what we saw on the Power Automate side, so I won't go through all the details. It's doing the same things of getting the employee data, the employee and manager IDs. It's doing the very same post to different SharePoint lists, but using the same techniques, sending the approvals, and then updating the item from there. So it's very much the same flow built in Logic App instead of Power Automate. The main thing is because of this trigger here, this HTTP trigger is a premium connector in Flow. We decided, well, let's use Logic App from this scenario's point of view. Okay, so let me come back to the deck here. So we've got the Logic App side that we went through. Now, we didn't look at Azure App Services, so let's come back here for a second. Another area of the Azure portal. This is where we actually have the HTML form and the JavaScript hosted from. So this URL here that we see, ess.envisionit.azurewebsites.net, that is the URL for the expense form itself. Now, we can actually set up a custom domain, so it's under Envision IT. Azure actually now has a preview feature where it'll create free SSL certificates for that as well, because we do want this all to go under SSL. So we can actually set that up, and it will manage the renewal of the certificates automatically for you, so you don't forget to renew those. Common error, I've done it myself. So you've got a fair bit of control around this. Now, app service plans are paid plans. We're using an S1 plan, which is a standard one plan. It costs about $140 a month or so to run this plan. Now, the reality is we have our main time tracking software that we run our business on running in the same app service plan. So you can have multiple apps in one plan. We only pay once for the one plan, and it goes across all of those. So you can actually group different applications together from that point of view. You can scale it up, you can scale it out. So right now we only have one instance. So we don't actually get an SLA from Microsoft. They won't guarantee the 99.5% uptime unless you have at least 2 instances running. But we're fine for that from our point of view. We can scale it out through instances. We can scale it up into higher performance ones through there as well, depending on what workloads you have in there. Obviously, this one's not heavily used, so S1 is fine for us. In fact, we run quite large systems for hundreds or thousands of users on dual S1 plans, and that works quite well. So the other piece to talk about is on the security side of things. So I didn't show you on the Logic App. Sorry, I know I'm jumping around a little bit here. Let's come back to the Logic App. So if we look at this from an edit point of view, and we come into this top trigger here. So this post URL at the top, this is the one that we put into the JavaScript to say that's how you post to this Logic App. It's generated the first time you save your Logic App, and then it stays the same from there. So you can copy it out, put it into your other code from there. The reality is that URL by default is anonymously available. Anybody can post to that anywhere in the world. Now there's things you can do to mitigate that. You can whitelist certain IPs so that only, say, your office IPs can submit to that. That's not super secure from that point of view. You can put up a shared credential that needs to be passed to that. But the problem in our example is that, effectively everything's clear text because it's all happening in JavaScript. Anybody can view the source for the application, and they would be able to see that URL. They'd be able to see that shared secret. It still wouldn't be secure from that point of view. So really what we want to do is put what's called API management in front of it. This is another service from Azure. It's actually a really rich service as you get into things like enterprise service buses and much broader, bigger API type of projects, but it works well for these simple ones as well. Basically what happens is that your logic app endpoint gets secured behind API management. So you can lock down your logic app so that people can't call it directly. They have to call through API management. And then we can apply Azure AD security so that the person calling into that, so this JavaScript that's running here needs to be authenticated, which it already is because we've wired this app service into Azure AD. So Azure AD becomes the key that locks this all together from a security point of view. And you can even get fancier because ideally what you want to do is not pass through a form value that has the employee email, because that's easy to hack and play with from a security point of view. You actually want API management to identify who the user is that's calling it from an Azure AD point of view. And it does that by requesting what's called a bearer token back from a OAuth security point of view. I know I'm getting pretty techie here, but basically that bearer token can be used for subsequent calls. And when you then call into the API management call, it can convert that bearer token, figure out the user that was signed in, that generated that request, and pass that information onto the logic apps. So the logic apps can take that, and it's no longer a user-provided parameter. It's something that's baked in from a security point of view that can't be changed, saying this is who just submitted this form. So if you need these forms to be rock solid from a security point of view, I know it adds some complexity, but this is how you need to do it from a proper point of view. I know I'm almost out of time here. I'm at 12:57. I've got one more poll that I want to do quick here, so let me pop that open here. Yeah, I'm just curious people's interests. I've branched across a number of different topics. I know I've jumped around a fair bit. Apologies for that. But I want to get a sense, hey, is this something you see yourself using for your organization? Do you want to get your hands on the technical bits? You're looking for some further guidance in terms of how you can use this with your organization. Okay, let me give you another 15, 20 seconds just to respond on that. Okay, let me close that out. Actually, let me share that out with everybody. So over half, yep, something you could see using yourself. So you're interested in working with that. And about 2/3 want to get your hands on the technical bits. I sometimes have issues. I work hard to get ready for the webinar, and then trying to get the bits out afterwards is a challenge. I think I'm pretty close on this one here. So my promise to you as attendees is by this weekend, if not through the weekend, I will get those technical bits finished up, and I'll get a GitHub repository spun up and provide those out to you from there. And if you'd like some further guidance, Logan can certainly coordinate that and reach out from that point of view. So I know I'm basically at the top of the hour now. I didn't update my slides, so I don't actually have the right upcoming events in here, but we do have a guest MVP webinar coming up April 29th. I'd encourage you to actually have a look at our events page on our Extranet User Manager site. Let me just go there now, because that'll give you a better view. In addition to that guest webinar, we do have a couple of Ask Me Anything. So for the Teams Provisioning open source, we actually have a new release that's coming out from that point of view. So I'm going to do sort of an open mic the first week of May. Just ask me anything around that. If you've got topics ahead of time, we'll figure out a way to have you pre-post questions there so we can prepare that and chat about that from that point of view. We've got SharePoint conference canceled now, so we should update this. There is a virtual conference that's happening as part of that. So we're actually just now rescheduling our MVP panel on the backside of that to align with the new plans from that point of view. We'll have Ben Nyland from ShareGate, Christian Buckley from Lab Talk, and I'm drawing a blank on who our third additional panelists is in through there. I should just pull it up. Jason, sorry, Jason. All 4 of us MVPs and just kind of talking about the announcements that are expected from that conference point of view. So with that, I think we're wrapped. We're literally at the top of the hour, so if there were questions there, we can certainly follow up afterwards and go from there. From that, I want to thank everybody for taking the time today. Have a great rest of your day.